All right, hello everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of Eno Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of Eno. For those who don't know, the mission of Eno is to shape public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues and build a network of innovative transportation professionals. And today's webinar is the latest in our rapid response series, and frankly, one we wish we didn't have to hold, but it's the Government Shutdown Fall 2023 edition. And so, despite work from lawmakers in both the House and the Senate this week, we now feel pretty confident that a federal government shutdown this weekend does appear likely. So, I am joined here by none other than Jeff Davis. I'm sure all of you know Jeff is a senior fellow at Eno and the founder and editor of Eno Transportation Weekly. Jeff is going to help us understand what the government shutdown means for transportation in terms of the budget. He'll discuss the official Department of Transportation shutdown plan. We'll talk about the different modes, the different departments, and provide insights into the potential challenges and disruptions that the transportation sector may face for things like aviation. Of course, there's an awful lot of uncertainty and things we still don't know, but Jeff will take your questions and comments. So please use the Q&A function on the webinar website to submit. We'll be looking at those throughout, so you don't have to wait until the end to submit your questions. I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to join us today. And with that, take it over, Jeff Davis.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. Before we get going into the what's going to happen during a shutdown bit, we'll just talk about briefly about the up to the moment efforts to avert it. The House Rules Committee met at 8 a.m. this morning to tee up debate that's ongoing right this minute on the House Republican version of a short-term stopgap CR, which would last for 1 month till October 31st. It would include one of those bipartisan fiscal commissions, super committee to help solve the real budget problems, which won't go anywhere. And also, it would reduce funding available, even if by averting a shutdown. It would include a 29.88565% across the board cut in all appropriations that are extended by this. So based on the 2023 levels, except for National Defense Budget Function, Department of Veterans Affairs, and Department of Homeland Security. So, but for things like FAA operations, that would be a real and significant cut. That would be for month. That would be about a $297 million a month cut to FAA operations during the duration of any such CR, which would probably necessitate some furloughs, at least some small amount of furloughs in fairly short orders because of lack of money. President Biden, about 20 minutes ago, issued a plain language veto threat that he will veto this version of a CR, even if it passes the House. So there's no guarantee they've got the votes. They've got a dozen or so dead enders who keep saying they will vote no on any stopgap CR period, and more on that might be afraid of this level of immediate funding cut. So, but that's what the House is going to pretend to do in the next couple of hours. On the Senate side, they have a CR that would perpetuate fiscal 2023 funding levels for 6 weeks, but it would also include $6 billion of extra funding for Ukraine, $6 billion of extra funding for disaster relief, and a series of other extensions for healthcare expiring programs, flood insurance, and the Federal Aviation Administration, because separately from all the appropriation stuff, the authorization for the Airport and Airway Trust Fund also runs out both on the spending side and on the tax side at midnight on September 30th. And so you can either deal with both in the same legislation or separate legislation. The House is apparently going to go the separate legislation way, but there's still no official sign they're going to bring up an FAA extension. Chairman Graves his staff circulated one Wednesday night, but there's still no formal sign that it's going to come up in the House. We're waiting for that later today. I think they're waiting after the up or down vote on the CR, which should happen about 11:30 or so, and then we shall see. Anyway, but because of all that, because the House is on such vastly different paths, and because President Biden has said he's going to veto the House Republican version, and because the shutdown is supposed to happen at midnight tomorrow night, it's looking very likely that the House and Senate are not going to get their act together anytime soon, and that the end result of that will be a lapse appropriation shutdown starting at the start of the fiscal year at midnight, September 30th, 12:01 a.m., October 1st. So here's what that doesn't and does mean, starting with the presentation here. The problem is not that the government's out of money. As of COB day before yesterday, there was $672 billion of cash sitting in the Treasury General Operations account waiting to be spent. So there's plenty of money. Now that account that got as low as $23 billion during the peak of the debt limit crisis a few months ago, and they generally run $20-some billion a day. Wednesday's Social Security payday, so that had been $700 billion the day before, and it dropped to 672 overnight because of the weekly nature of Social Security. But again, there's plenty of cash. The lack of cash is not the problem, as it would have been had we had a shutdown because of debt limit back a few months ago. This is a separate set of issues. The problem is a combination of two things. We have the lapse of budget authority. Budget authority is the legal authority to incur new obligations that Uncle Sam will have to pay someday. And for most appropriation funded programs as of October 1st. The most common form of budget authority is an appropriation from the Appropriations Committee. And you combine the lapse of valid appropriations for many accounts and programs with the Anti-Deficiency Act, a 130-some-year-old law, which makes it a felony crime, up to 2 years in the hoosegow for a federal employee or supervisor to incur new obligations without specific budget authority to do so. And simply showing up for work, if you're a federal employee, creates a legal obligation for Uncle Sam to pay you for that work you've done, which is why the Anti-Deficiency Act also prohibits voluntary services, except in very specific situations where a legal internship or something like that is established by law. So the combination of these two factors, lapse of budget authority and the Anti-Deficiency Act that criminalizes new obligations without budget authority, is what creates a lapse of appropriation shutdown like we are likely to have. So yes, question one obviously is, whatever your individual program or agency is, what budget authority will still be available on October 1st? Fortunately, the IIJA was enacted in November 2021 and has changed things for the better since the last shutdown. So first of all, contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund provided by the IIJA for fiscal 24 is still on the books. It will become available in full at 12:01 a.m. on October 1st, legally speaking, just like it was in 2023. No difference there. Also, the IIJA, somewhat novelly not even a word, but originally, if it hadn't been done before, provided 5 years of advance appropriations from the general fund. So these appropriations have already been made, and the fiscal 2024 tranche of these funds pops up into being, available for obligation on October 1st. So anybody whose salary is paid out of Highway Trust Fund Contract Authority or the IIJA advances will be unaffected by the shutdown. Now, also, not all appropriations are 1 year. The FAA operations, I believe, is 2 years. They're available for the first year, then the second year, if there's any left over. There are several other DOT budget accounts that have multi-year availability. I think MARAD stuff does. And then there are some appropriations where, let's say, remain available until expended. So if it's not any unobligated balance from a prior year that's still available, rolls over. So in some cases, agencies and accounts haven't obligated it all yet, and they can go for weeks, sometimes months, based on that carryover. And also, some agencies have permanent authority to spend incoming receipts or fees, or there are also some funds that are like the revolving funds or transfer funds for example, the working capital funds. Each modal administration within DOT has built a certain percentage of the capital fund for running the building, running the headquarters building. And to the extent that those parent agencies are funded by contract authority or advanced appropriations, that's still going into the working capital fund. They can make use of that. And there's also rollover from year to year on that as well. So that's the kind of thing that will still be available on October 1st, even if we have a government shutdown for everything else. So the good news is there are 5 modal administrations that will have 100% of their budget authority available and will be unaffected by any kind of shutdown. The Federal Highway Administration, the federal, it's entirely either Highway Trust Fund, Contract Authority, or IIJ advances. All those salaries are paid that way. The Federal Transit Administration, and this is new. The IIJA changed things. The last time we had a government shutdown, FTA salaries were almost all paid out of annual general fund appropriations. But the IIJA moved all the FTA salaries into the trust fund. So FTA is not going to be affected by a shutdown. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has always been completely contract authority funded. So they're fine. NHTSA is, they were affected by shutdown last time, but their IIJA advances on the vehicle safety side are so broadly phrased that it looks like NHTSA will be able to pay all of its general fund people out of the IIJ money. No disruptions there. And then the Great Lakes Seaway, formerly the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, has two funds. One is paid by annual appropriations, but the other is a revolving fund taken out of, I believe, the Seaway tolls and some other stuff. So, and then there's $40-some million of carryover balances, I think, in that fund. So the Seaway can pay people out of that for at least 6 months and be fine. And no one really has any, if this shutdown lasts, anywhere nearly that long, there will be a lot of other problems that will have overtaken us all well before that have nothing to do with transportation. So again, everything's hunky-dory at federal highways, federal transit, motor carrier, NHTSA, and the Seaway. In fact, so everyone there shows up with regular work, full pay. All obligations are going to be honored. New obligations and new contracts can continue to be made, new projects approved. And for state DOTs and transit agencies, the daily reimbursements of federal aid projects that have been fulfilled and liquidated are still good to go. So those will continue to be made. Now, these contract authority programs do require a technical appropriation called liquidating cash that, and I believe there's like $47 billion DOT-wide carryover still unspent of that. Now they would conceivably run out 3 to 9 months from now, depending on the mode. But again, if a shutdown goes more than 3 or 4 months, we're going to have a lot of other problems to deal with before you get to that. And it's particularly interesting at federal highways because they're actually better off in a government shutdown than they are with an appropriation, at least for 6 to 9 months, because the IIJ provides annual funding increases for the federal highway program. But under the normal system, they have to wait until the annual appropriations bill is done before they can realize that funding increase. But in the absence of any appropriations law, and that's been in the past 3 to 5 months into the fiscal year, it's getting ridiculous. But in the absence of any appropriations law at all, the Section 1102 obligation limitation in the IIJA governs things. So FHW will get its $1.3 billion funding increase up front instead of having to wait until December, January, February, whatever. During the last shutdown, which started, I believe, on December 21st, FHWA eventually wound up having to increase funding, for everybody in a notice they gave out for the full year money. And that took, I think, till January 8th. But that was because you had Christmas and New Year's holidays in between there. It shouldn't take, going on 3 weeks for that obligation notice to go out this time if a shutdown continues. But then eventually, if you get a full year CR, a part-term CR, they would take that back and only give out the prorated amount of money. But in any case, federal highways is actually better off if without an obligation limit. They will everyone gets a rate, gets their bump sooner rather than later. Now again, so those 5 modal administrations are good to go for many months. There are 3 modal administrations where most of the budget authority will still be available in a shutdown. Office of the Secretary. Most of the FTEs there are either at the Volpe Center up in Cambridge, which is funded by one of these working capital revolving funds, or else the headquarters revolving capital fund. Or in many cases, multi-year advance appropriations are available, particularly for these new grant programs, the Build America Bureau, or essential air service fees that are truly mandatory. About 75% of maritime administration staff will be paid for the time being from carryover appropriations from prior year stuff. And then a little over half of PHMSA employees will continue to be paid because, it's basically two agencies, the pipeline agency and the hazmat agency. They haven't always been in the same administration. And the pipeline side is largely fee funded. So they can go on, whereas the hazmat side are completely subject to annual general fund appropriations. And then very little budget authority is available for the FAA, which has some separate issues we'll discuss later, the Federal Railroad Administration, and the Inspector General. The FAA does have some contract authority, but it also expires September 30th when the authorization expires. And in any case, that's Office of Airports only about 4% of the total FTEs. And there are some other multi-year or advanced appropriations that are left over that would continue to fund a few other people there. And then 17% of the FRA staff can be paid out of those IIJA advances for the grant programs, of which I think 2% gets turned over to oversight. So, and that's a big increase from the last shutdown, where I think nobody at FRA had any money left over. And there will be no valid budget authority left for anybody in the Inspector General's office. Because there's no budget authority means you can't get paid. But because this is a legal opinion, and the last time it was reinterpreted was by Benjamin Civiletti, Jimmy Carter's Attorney General in 1980, they have come up with some loopholes in the Anti-Deficiency Act. And the most significant of those is the life and safety exception, where that, I believe, how do they say it? A reasonable, articulable connection between the obligation and the safety of life and the protection of property, and some reasonable likelihood that either the safety of life or the protection of property would be compromised in some significant degree by failure to carry out the function in question. So there are many people at DOT who would have to continue to show up for work because the lawyers have ruled that the function they cover would, if they didn't do it, there would be some significant degree of jeopardy of the safety of life or the protection of property. We'll get into that mode by mode in a minute. There are also a few other exceptions for having to work without pay. For example, if it's function necessary to discharge the president's constitutional duties. There's a few people at FAA who have to work because they're liaisons with foreign aviation authorities. And that's part of the president's conduct of diplomacy. Supervising the executive branch, which means that the senior management, the secretary, the deputy secretary, people have been confirmed by the Senate, and a couple of assistants there will have to show up. And participating in the legislative process usually means that the congressional liaison teams can continue to show up for work without pay. So those are the principles here. And then we're going to get into the individual modes, because DOT has released a shutdown plan, which actually you go to transportation.gov/LAPSE, LAPSE. They've got a very easy to remember URL for their detailed shutdown plan. So in the Office of the Secretary, Headquarter Building Operations, Volpe Center, IT and Cybersecurity, Transportation Planning R&D, Essential Air Service, the financing, it's not called the Build America Bureau anymore, whatever the bureau is, and DBE Outreach are all going to continue, either because they have separate budget authority or because they fall under these exceptions to the Anti-Deficiency Act. But most policy work, most public affairs work, most legal support, administrative law judges, and most of the HR stuff will get suspended. At Maritime Administration, they've got enough carryover money to run the Merchant Marine Academy for a while, so everyone there is going to continue to work. They don't say how long a while it is, but at least a few weeks. The security side stuff also has carryover money. The Ready Reserve Fleet, Maritime Security Program, the new tanker and cable security accounts, and also the new training vessel program for the academy is all forward funded. So that's until that carryover money, they're good for a while. The Port Infrastructure Grant Program is funded by IIJA advances for the most part, and they can use that money to pay those people. Marine highway grants and the Title 11 loans will continue. Those programs will all continue at least for a few weeks or months during a shutdown. But all U.S. flag vessel registrations and transfers get suspended. the office of cargo, except for the most emergency Jones Act waivers. But the rest of the more traditional Jones Act stuff doesn't get done. All admin, legal support, policy work, planning, and congressional affairs and civil rights offices would close. At Pipeline and Hazmat, again, like I said, Pipeline keeps going. The Hazmat accident investigations and Hazmat safety inspections and enforcement, Hazmat approvals for emergencies that imminently threaten safety, those all continue under the life safety exception. And emergency preparedness fund payments, there's some mandatory funding there. I forget. I think they get paid. But all hazmat activities that are not listed there, including fee collections and the grants making those collections, that shuts down. And then your public affairs, civil rights, legal support, HR also shuts down. Federal Railroad. The railroad accident investigations will continue under the life safety exception, as will on-site railroad safety inspections. They got 100 people or so that working now being paid from those IIJ advances running most of the railroad grant programs in the Office of Railroad Development, and they would continue, I believe, with pay. And then some support activities for all the above they can pay out of those IIJ advances. The entire railroad R&D account gets shut down, and anything else they're doing that's not subject to life safety exception or IIJ stuff gets shut down at federal railroads. The Inspector General says they're going to continue their law enforcement activities and the hotline and crisis management center points of contact and the necessary support for those things under the various exceptions, and then everything else gets suspended. All the other audit stuff slows to a halt. Now, the FAA has two problems that I mentioned. To continue functioning normally, they've got to have some kind of law enacted to extend the appropriated budget authority for the operations account, the facilities equipment account, and the research engineering development account. And also, they have to have the extension of the authorization law in place, which includes budget authority for airport grants and also the Airport and Airway Trust Fund expenditure authority and taxes. And the reason for this, they got to both be in place because even though, so a lot of the appropriations that a CR would extend for the FAA are drawn on the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. I believe something like 80%-ish of the operations appropriation is drawn from the trust fund. All the facilities equipment, all of RE&D are drawn from the trust fund, and they're paid out of that. And so even if a CR extends those appropriations, if they're drawn on the trust fund, there's a hard cutoff in Section 9503D of the Internal Revenue Code that says that the minute that the trust fund expires, any budget authority drawn on that becomes invalid for new obligations. So having a CR without having a FAA Airport and Airway Trust Fund extension, appropriations wise for the FAA alone is the same thing as not having a CR. The budget authority is not available because the underlying trust fund from which it's drawn doesn't exist at the moment. Now, the other thing that happens if appropriations are extended with authorization is that airlines get to stop paying their taxes into the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. The 7.5% tax on an airline ticket, the segment fees, international departure and arrival fees, and the air cargo waybill tax, and plus that fractional stuff, all goes away. Now, again, the airlines that collect these could choose to lower fares across the board by 7.5% plus whatever the segment fees wind up to be, if they wanted to. Something tells me that they won't. So you're getting a significant tax windfall for the airlines the minute that the taxes expire. Now, if the FAA authorization is extended, but the appropriations aren't, the Office of Airports remains open to give out AIP money, and its people get fully funded. And the other airport grants funded by the IIJ advances stay going, but the rest of the FAA is shut down, subject to that life safety exemption. So, again, during FAA shutdown, you've got air traffic control will continue without pay. Flight standards inspections will continue. Airworthiness directives continue. The medical certifications, both for airmen and for senior air traffic controllers, continue. Some certification of manufacturers will continue at some the most safety sensitive stuff. Commercial space launch will continue. Some UAS waivers will continue to be issued, and any of the airport grants for the terminal program or the IP program funded by the IIJA, and if contract authorities renew the inter reauthorization by the regular contract authority IP program, will continue. But most importantly, for long term, what stops in the shutdown is the training of air traffic controllers who are not yet position certified. The academy in Oklahoma City shuts down. If it lasts long enough, they have to cancel the contracts of all the employees who work at the academy under contract, and everyone goes home. And then once you get a new appropriations law in place, you got to rehire everybody who was under contract to get them back, and you lose months and months. You got to flush an entire class of controller trainees and then redo them. That was one of the biggest thing we learned from the last shutdown, is how much that hurts the controller hiring plan. Aviation rulemaking will stop. Passenger facility charge approvals will stop. Most of the next gen stuff is going to stop. All the research, engineering, development activities will stop, and then the general support activities will stop. So that's what happens at the FAA under a shutdown. Then this is just the summary from the latest shutdown plan. Again, at transportation.gov/lapse. You got 34% of the DOT employees are going to be furloughed. 40% got to work without pay, and then 17% would be working with pay. But those 17% control the vast majority of the grant programs at DOT, including almost all of the same-day reimbursements that DOT's partners at state and local government have come to expect when they're spending federal aid funds. So that is the presentation, and we'll be glad to take some questions.
Fantastic. There's really nobody else better to give this presentation to walk us through this than Jeff Davis. So Jeff, thank you for putting all that together, especially here with all this uncertainty. So keep the questions coming in. We've got a whole bunch in here. I'm going to try to categorize these by similar questions. But let's start with some questions about the trust fund. So one question, curious about how the shutdown affects the receipts and outlays in and out of the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Are they just not collected? What happens to those receipts?
The Highway Trust Fund?
Highway Trust Fund.
Good question. The Highway Trust Fund tax receipts are paid by, for the most part, fuel refiners, oil companies, and the truck tax is paid by the sales, by the manufacturers, similar to tires. But those excise taxes are all paid on an estimated basis twice a month, middle of the month and end of the month, based on the preceding activity, and then immediately they're deposited in the general fund, immediately credited to the trust fund. So depending on how bad the IRS shutdown is, the next tax payment in mid-October might be delayed. And also, that one's extra big because to do the year-end reconciliation, the Highway Trust Fund they have to go 6 weeks from September 1st through mid-October of spending every day at high seasonal rates. But they only get one transfer because the mid-October transfer is reconciles the previous 2 weeks of the last year, and then the first 2 weeks of the new year retroactively credited, and it's a big mega difference. But in a regular year, that would be a problem. But the trust fund is still sitting on $100 billion of IIJA bailout money that's still in there. So even though the IRS shutdown would delay that mid-October transfer probably by a week or two, they've still got plenty of money to come in. And the law is such that the taxpayers have to keep filing their estimated taxes paying the estimated every 2 weeks, twice a month. I mean, no matter if anyone at the IRS is there to process them or not.
So let's tick through a couple other modes here. Well, first of all, couple of folks have asked for a link to the DOT website. It's www.transportation.gov/lapse, LAPSE.
Yes.
And these slides will be available when we have put the recording of this webinar up on our YouTube site. So if you go to YouTube, look for Eno Center for Transportation. This will be up there, and all the slides in this discussion. So what about Amtrak? We didn't talk about Amtrak in here. How was Amtrak affected by any potential shutdown?
Not much, because Amtrak isn't affected usually by fluctuations in monthly, in week to week or month to month funding levels. Amtrak is not a part of the federal government technically for at least for bookkeeping reasons. So they used to spend out at 100% rate a year, where they would get one big check a year from each account, and then it would instantly appear as a 100% obligation and outlay in the first year on the federal budget side of things. No matter how long Amtrak could take years to actually spend that money in the real world, but once it goes off the federal government's books and is transferred to Amtrak, it's not, the feds don't keep track of the money anymore. I think that the norm that's now been broken up into 3 or 4 checks a year, but normally Amtrak wouldn't be getting the first tranche of its annual federal subsidies for weeks or months into the fiscal year anyway. So Amtrak should not be affected at all by any of this. They got their money last year. They're going to get their IIJ money at some point, and their carryover and stuff is that they're not legally affected by the Anti-Deficiency Act or anybody else, because they're not technically federal employees.
Some relief in here that the most of the transit FTA employees will be spared this time around, given the IIJA connection here.
Yeah. I saw a question on there. What does IIJA stand for? Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's the technical term, the legal title for the bipartisan infrastructure law. I don't know why the administration is insistent on calling it bill when legally the name is IIJA, unless I always think that it's because Biden's Irish, and in Ireland, that's Ija is how you pronounce the word. We pronounce idiot. So that's my belief on why they don't use IIJ as an acronym, because you want to pronounce it Ija, and you can't do that in Ireland.
There's a new one on me. All right, let's go to aviation then. So you talked a bit about this, but the plan, the DOT shutdown plan, shows that the ATC, the air traffic controllers, will still be working. So are they working without pay? How do they get their back pay then, assuming that when they come back? And then how is that different, if at all, across other government agencies?
They'll be working without guarantee of pay. But again, you got to let a shutdown last at least a couple of weeks before that's really felt, because they start incurring work. They start working and incurring obligations, and usually under a 2-week pay period or whatever, and then they're paid for that period. So eventually, and on every previous shutdown, Congress has passed a law after it ended that restores pay retroactively to people. But for the most part, I believe the way civil service pay works, it'll take a week or two before they actually miss a paycheck. So it's just working without pay means without guarantee of eventual pay, but it's a sort of looming problem for the first couple of weeks, and does not become an active hole in your checkbook problem until the shutdown goes on that long. And usually in the past, once that happens, that's what causes the political will to keep a shutdown going to end right quick.
And I'm glad you talked through the challenges with the trainees around air traffic controllers, and just so folks know, this was a big impetus behind some of Eno's work into recommending that the FAA spin off air traffic control into an independent nonprofit entity, like it's done in many other countries like Canada. You can find all that on Eno's website. So as the siren goes by, one other question on airlines or on aviation: are the airlines obligated to pay or pay back the airport and airway tax that is at the 7.5 figure at a later date? What happens to that?
Not my understanding, and I believe in past shutdowns they have not done so. Congress actually intentionally let the taxes expire for about 9 months, about 20 years ago, and then they waited until after the CBO and OMB had done their budget baselines in February, and then reenacted them as new money. So they got credit for, if you let them go past February, you can reenact them and get credit as new revenue instead of being built into the baseline. But there was they have not been made to repay that in the past.
Couple of questions. I'm going to read this one getting a little more detailed now. Where did it go? So if a NOFO, if a notice of funding opportunities on the street, it seems that there was authority to solicit applications and make awards. But if that entails having the Office of the Secretary of Transportation policy and related staff to make a decision. So does it matter, practically speaking, that the authority is available? Will discretionary expectations for awards have to be tempered?
If this goes on for a while, again, there are a lot of grant programs where that statutorily, I believe, the modal administration may be in charge, but we all know that at the end of the day, that it's a lot of the people in the office, the undersecretary for policy, who wind up helping run the matrix to select those projects. And to the extent that those people are furloughed, they can, the secretary is going to still be at work. He can sit there and do this himself with the people from the modal administrations who are allowed to stay there with pay. And there are a few people in there, and there are enough grants in the IAJ going to the secretary's office that I'm sure a couple of people are paid in there, including most of the like the Innovative Financing Bureau. So things like infra grants that statutorily are running through, and actually they're running through the multimodal office. But yeah, there's stuff out there. It's great. I don't expect, but again, this administration is also wanting to try to point out that shutdowns are bad and painful. So I don't think they would want to be in the business of making new grant announcements during a shutdown anyway, just for optics, even if they had legal authority. I mean, they'll keep the trains running, but I don't think they want to be. I don't think you'll see anything revolving good news, released by any federal agency during a shutdown just for pure optics reasons.
Makes a lot of sense. That's a really good insight. Do we know if engineering and construction work from the Office of Personnel Management is being flagged as critical work and would continue during a shutdown? It looks like there was guidance that was expected by the end of September. I guess we haven't got that yet.
Look here. OPM updated their shutdown plan yesterday, and it's on their website. It's a long acronym, but the OMB, go to budget.gov and then click on information. Go to budget.gov, click on information and guidance on the right, and it's got a link there for agency contingency plans, where every single agency's shutdown plan is posted, and OPM posted theirs yesterday. So I can't read it right this moment, but that's they'll let that know.
We're getting specific in some of these here too. So lots of chatter in the popular press about contractors who work sometimes without obvious differences from their federal employees who might get stop work orders. So does that make sense? Is it any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I can't remember how a lot of those worked last time. If it's a contract that there's no longer any legal authority to renew, I mean, they might get a stop work order. But to the extent those contracts legally run for multiple years, I'm honestly not sure how that works, Susan. Some might not. Again, if there's budget authority available for salaries, there's also budget authority available for contracts. Now, anything that's you can't make a contractor work on the life safety exception, I don't think. So anything that would be that would be funded out of that, they get a stop work order. But if there's money to pay a salary, there's money to pay a contractor. There's no difference in that in the Anti-Deficiency Act.
And I think we answered the first part of this, but let me ask both. So how does a shutdown affect state DOTs who received federal aid reimbursements? Or how does the shutdown affect state DOTs to advance projects to the next phase? Does that whole element get put on pause now during the shutdown?
It should not. If it's a highway or a mass transit project, everybody should be at work and fully funded and able to do all of the things on October 2nd that they were able to do on September, 29th or whatever. At FRA, I'm not sure how much they're when they're trying to advance corridor projects on who's left at the rail development office. But so for those, it's good. And I don't airport grants. I'm not sure. It depends on whether the separate FAA extension gets enacted before the airport office people show up in advance projects. But again, reimbursement should continue unabated, and everything else FHWA and FTA do should also continue pretty much as normal.
Does that go for FAA as well? For long-term procurement efforts like next gen for air traffic control? What happens to those?
No. Again, that's more direct spending, and a lot of the next gen planning and contracting stuff will be on hold under a shutdown. So, but remember that the next gen is all direct spending through federal contracts, not grants to other government entities. So,
Let's add a couple of big picture things and related, unrelated. So, any major impact with the passing of Senator Feinstein? Anything? And Senator Stabenow out due to COVID. Any impact of that on this whole procedure?
One of the things they're working on in the Senate right now is adding some kind of amount of border security funding, and so to the extent that Feinstein might have been resistant to that. It's one vote less if it happens over the weekend. But I expect that Governor Newsom will name a replacement fairly soon to be in place by next week. And on these other things, since they're doing cloture votes, absentees don't matter. Cloture is in the Senate is done. It's a hard. I guess with Senator Pass, it's going to be hard 59, but Stabenow's absence doesn't really matter. You've either got to get to 59 or you don't. And they're looking to do a significant, well above 60 vote on a CR in the Senate to give it momentum in the House. And the preliminary votes have had like 76, 77, I think. So they're looking to keep that. So I don't see the passing of Senator Feinstein and the temporary absence of Senator Stabenow as making a difference on where the votes are on CRs this weekend. They'll be back probably next week. Senator Feinstein may cause a musical chairs situation in Senate Appropriations because she had the Energy and Water Subcommittee gavel. So that would someone else may want that to be able to control Corps of Engineers water project funding. We'll see how that shakes out, but that's more of a long-term thing.
Regular disruptions, but not particular to the shutdown.
Yeah.
So it generally seems a couple of questions here. It seems like we're going to be okay for a couple of months, but what does happen long term? You may reference this a couple of times. We'll have bigger problems. If everything goes really terrible, what is the long term implications of a long term shutdown? Last time it was a month, I think. What happens if it does go longer than that?
After when federal employees stop start missing paychecks for work they've had to do, that's when you really start seeing political problems. I mean, and you'll also start seeing sick outs. What started to happen last time was once the controllers missed a paycheck, they were suddenly not as eager to go to work on time every day, and you started to see air traffic delays building up. And again, unlike the situation in 1981, where there was clearly a law that made it illegal to strike, and they struck anyway, I'm not at all sure it's that a order to, or even if there was a law ordering air traffic controllers to show up and work without pay would stand up in court. There's some ban on involuntary servitude in the Constitution you may have seen, and so I'm a legal action, a work action by air traffic control or other FAA employees who are being forced to work weeks on end without pay would be a very different thing, both PR wise and legally, than a strike. So that's once they start missing paychecks, they'll be justifiably angry, and much less eager to go show up at work on time if not getting paid. And eventually you'll start seeing, airport delays. If a bunch of one if a lot of the guys in New York TradeCon decide to do that all at once, you would see a cascade of delays that would wake people up, and then just multiply that by many other situations. At some point, Border Patrol agents are going to get upset about having to work, out in the heat every day without getting paid once they miss a paycheck. Things like that. And then what happened, as I recall, a few years ago, is that you started seeing the lines broke pretty quickly, and the congressional Republicans started to say, okay, well, we'll extend the pay for the border guys, but not this. You extend appropriations to pay these guys a bit at a time, and then eventually, once you do that enough, there's no real rationale for what's left. There's a good article by Philip Bump in the Washington Post today, calling this the Seinfeld shutdown. It's a shutdown about nothing, and it's not really about nothing, but it's the 2013 shutdown. Republicans had been saying defund Obamacare for a whole year. It was building up to that, and then the last one was about funding the wall. You've been 8 months of talking about funding the wall. They finally built on that, but there's no single demand for this one, and that can tell you exactly why it's happening. There's a ever shifting list of demands, and that's makes it all much harder to figure out how it's going to go away.
This may be then a good segue then to the last question. So obviously nobody follows this as close as Jeff Davis, and your insights all across the board have been really valuable. So what is Jeff Davis most concerned about with this current stalemate?
Again, long-term flushing a whole class out of the FAA Academy is bad. We're already starting to see the workforce shortage. This is going to make that worse. Secretary Buttigieg has made this case several times, including last week to T&I committee, and I'm sure that if this starts happening on Monday morning again, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, the shutdown technically would begin on Sunday morning, but realistically speaking, unless you already were scheduled to show up at work on Sunday, it won't apply to you. It'll start functioning en masse first thing Monday morning. People got to show up at work or remotely, get their furlough notice, and go home. There are. That's the biggest. The biggest is the long-term effects it has on air traffic control. And again, a CR is no picnic. You're still stuck in last year's problem. You can't plan ahead. You can't do anything. But it beats a shutdown. So
good cautions all around.
Yeah,
we're clearly sorry that we're in this situation this weekend, but we're very glad that Jeff is here to help us walk through all of this stuff. The information you presented is really valuable, and again, judging from the comments and everything else, everybody's very grateful. As I mentioned, you can get a recording of this webinar on our YouTube site. Just search for Eno Center for Transportation. You'll get a copy of this discussion and the slides. If you'd like more information about Eno, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. While you're there, please do check out Eno Transportation Weekly that Jeff edits. It's our flagship publication and an indispensable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. And while you're on our website, check out the range of professional development programs that we have planned for 2014, including our long-running Transportation Senior Executive and Transportation Mid-Manager programs. And look for our upcoming webinars. Our next one is going to be on October 12th, which is going to be focused on AI and transportation off of a recent paper we produced earlier this month. So once again, many thanks, Jeff, for your insights and for pulling all this together. And thank you all very much for joining us. Be well, everybody.